Have you ever wondered why the Bible speaks so little about the daughters of the patriarchs, while their sons receive entire chapters dedicated to their lives and legacies? There's one story in particular that has been whispered about in scholarly circles for centuries, yet remains largely untold in most churches and biblical discussions. The story of Dinah, the only named daughter of Jacob, a young woman whose fate would shake the very foundations of her family, and whose silence in Scripture speaks louder than words. Could you imagine being the only daughter among 12 brothers, living in a world where your voice mattered less than your brother's shadows, where your story was deemed too dangerous, too controversial to be fully told? Dinah's tale is not just another biblical narrative. It's a window into the harsh realities faced by women in ancient times, and a testament to how power, family honor, and revenge can collide in the most devastating ways. What happened to this forgotten daughter of Israel? And why does her story remain shrouded in mystery and uncomfortable silence? If you're ready to uncover one of the most disturbing, yet profound stories hidden within the pages of Scripture, then stay with me, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about the patriarchal families and the price of being a woman in the ancient world. The story begins in the land of Canaan, where Jacob had finally returned after his years of exile fleeing from his brother Esau's wrath. Jacob, now called Israel, had become a man of great wealth and influence. His flocks numbered in the thousands, his servants were many, and his family had grown to include 12 sons and at least one daughter, Dinah, born to Leah, Jacob's first wife. Though not his beloved, this family had wandered through the wilderness, experienced divine encounters, and witnessed miracles. Yet they were still foreigners in a land filled with established peoples and ancient cities. It was during this time of relative peace and prosperity that Jacob made a decision that would alter the course of his family's destiny forever. He chose to settle near the city of Shechem, a place that seemed safe and welcoming. The prince of the city shared the same name as his domain, Shechem, son of Hamor, the Hivite, and this young ruler had taken notice of Jacob's family, particularly the presence of a beautiful young woman among them. Jacob purchased land from Hamor, establishing what appeared to be a peaceful relationship between his clan and the inhabitants of the city. He built an altar, there calling it El Elohe Israel, meaning God, the God of Israel. It seemed as though this nomadic family had finally found a place to call home, but beneath the surface of this apparent harmony, darker currents were already beginning to stir. The ancient world was a place where women held little power, where their bodies were considered property, and where family honor could be defended or destroyed by the actions taken against female relatives. Dinah, growing up as the only daughter among so many brothers, would have lived a life of careful protection, yet also profound isolation. She was precious to her family, not just as a person, but as a symbol of their honor and purity in a culture where a woman's virtue was directly tied to her family's standing in the community. The biblical account tells us that Dinah went out to see the women of the land, a simple phrase that contains layers of meaning and cultural significance. This wasn't merely a casual visit or a shopping trip in our modern understanding. This was a young woman seeking connection, community, and perhaps a glimpse of life beyond the confines of her father's tents. She wanted to understand the world around her, to learn from other women, to experience the broader culture of Canaan. It was a natural human desire for social interaction and cultural exchange. Yet this innocent desire for connection would lead to catastrophe in ways that no one could have anticipated. The text tells us that when Shechem the prince saw Dinah, he took her and lay with her and humbled her. These words in the original Hebrew carry the weight of violence and violation. The phrase "took her" suggests force. The term "lay with her" indicates sexual contact, and "humbled her" speaks to the degradation and shame that was inflicted upon her. This was not a romantic encounter. This was an assault, an abuse of power by a man who saw something he wanted and simply took it without consent. without consideration for the devastating consequences. But then something unexpected happens in the narrative. After this act of violence, the text tells us that Shechem's soul clung to Dinah, and he loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. This creates one of the most complex and troubling aspects of the entire story. How do we reconcile genuine affection with an act of violence? How do we understand a man who commits assault yet claims love? Was this truly love, or was it possession? Was his tenderness genuine remorse, or merely the manipulative behavior of someone trying to legitimize his actions? The psychological complexity doesn't end there. Shechem immediately goes to his father Hamor and requests that he arrange a marriage with Dinah. This wasn't uncommon in the ancient world, where marriages were often arranged to formalize relationships that had already been consummated, whether consensually or not, but it reveals the cultural mindset of the time, where a woman's agency in her own life was virtually non-existent. Decisions about her future, her body and her destiny were made by the men around her, whether her father, her brothers, or in this case, the man who had violated her. Meanwhile, Jacob learned what had happened to his daughter while his sons were in the field with the livestock. The text tells us that Jacob held his peace until his sons came home. This phrase, held his peace, has been interpreted in various ways by scholars. Some see it as wisdom, suggesting that Jacob understood the gravity of the situation and wanted to consult with his sons before taking action. Others view it as weakness or indifference, suggesting that Jacob was more concerned about political ramifications than his daughter's well-being. The silence of Jacob in this moment becomes almost as significant as the violence itself. When Jacob's sons returned and learned what had happened, their reaction was immediate and intense. The scriptures tell us they were grieved and very angry because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing should not be done. Their anger wasn't just emotional, it was righteous indignation rooted in their understanding of family honor, cultural values, and the violation of their sister's dignity. They saw this not just as a crime against Dinah, but as an insult to their entire lineage. The word disgraceful in the original Hebrew carries profound weight. It suggests something that brings shame upon an entire community, something that violates the fundamental order of society. The brothers understood that what had happened to Dinah was more than a personal tragedy. It was a threat to their family's reputation, their standing in the community, and their future relationships with other tribes and peoples. This perspective, while perhaps foreign to modern sensibilities, was very real in their cultural context. Hamor arrived to speak with Jacob about arranging a marriage between his son and Dinah. He came with what appeared to be honorable intentions, seeking to make things right through proper legal channels. He even proposed a broader alliance between their peoples, suggesting intermarriage between the families and mutual trade agreements. From Hamor's perspective, this was a reasonable solution that would benefit everyone involved. It would legitimize his son's relationship with Dinah, provide economic opportunities for both families, and create lasting peace between their communities. But Hamor and his son Shechem had no understanding of the depth of anger and pain they had caused. They saw the situation through the lens of their own cultural norms, where powerful men could take what they wanted and then negotiate terms afterward. They failed to grasp that Jacob's family operated under different moral standards, different concepts of justice, and different understandings of human dignity. The gap between these worldviews would prove to be unbridgeable. Shechem himself spoke to Jacob and his sons, offering to pay any bride price they demanded. He declared his love for Dinah and his desire to marry her, promising to give whatever they asked in return for her hand in marriage. His words might have seemed sincere, but they were built upon a foundation of violence and violation. He was essentially asking them to sell him their sister and daughter after he had already taken her by force. The audacity of this request would have been staggering to Jacob's family. The brothers, however, had already decided on their course of action, but they wouldn't reveal their true intentions. Instead, they spoke deceitfully to Shechem and Hamor, telling them that they could not give their sister to a man who was uncircumcised, because that would be a disgrace to them. They proposed what seemed like a reasonable compromise. If all the males in Shechem's city would be circumcised, then they would give Dinah in marriage, allow intermarriage between their peoples, and dwell together as one people. This demand for circumcision wasn't arbitrary. It was a test and a trap. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. It represented not just a physical procedure, but a spiritual commitment, a joining of oneself to the God of Israel. By demanding this, the brothers were essentially asking the entire city to convert to their faith, to abandon their own gods and customs, and to submit to the authority of Jacob's God. Shechem and Hamor were so eager to secure the marriage and the economic benefits of alliance with Jacob's prosperous family that they agreed to the terms. They returned to their city and convinced all the males to undergo circumcision, arguing that it would bring them wealth and opportunity through partnership with Jacob's clan. The men of the city, seeing the potential for economic gain and trusting their leaders, agreed to the painful procedure. What happened next would become one of the most controversial acts of revenge in biblical history. While the men of Shechem were still in pain from their circumcision on the third day when they were most vulnerable, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, took their swords and came upon the city, boldly killing every male. They rescued Dinah from Shechem's house. But their vengeance didn't stop there. The other sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, taking their flocks, herds, donkeys, and all their wealth. They carried away all their possessions and made captives of all their wives and children. The scope of this retaliation was staggering. An entire city was destroyed. Families were torn apart. Children were orphaned and widowed. Women were left destitute, all because of what one man had done to one woman. The brothers' actions raised profound questions about justice, proportionality, and the cycle of violence that can spiral out of control when honor and revenge become the driving forces behind human action. Jacob's response to his son's actions reveals the complexity of his character and the difficult position he found himself in. He didn't condemn them for seeking justice for their sister, but he was deeply concerned about the practical consequences of their actions. He told them that they had made him odious to the inhabitants of the land, that he was few in number, and that if his neighbors gathered together against him, he and his household would be destroyed. Jacob's focus seemed to be on survival and political stability rather than moral evaluation of what had been done. But Simeon and Levi had the final word. In this exchange, they asked their father a question that has echoed through the centuries: should he treat our sister like a harlot? Their question cut to the heart of the matter, challenging anyone who would criticize their actions to consider what they would have done if their own sister had been violated. They saw their response not as excessive violence, but as necessary justice, not as criminal behavior, but as the defense of family honor and feminine dignity that society had failed to provide. The aftermath of these events would have lasting consequences for Jacob's family. The memory of what happened at Shechem would follow them for generations. Jacob himself would remember these actions on his deathbed when he blessed his sons. He would speak of Simeon and Levi's anger and violence, declaring that their anger was fierce and their wrath cruel. He would prophesy that they would be divided and scattered in Israel, a prophecy that would come to pass in the distribution of the promised land. But what happened to Dinah herself in all of this chaos and bloodshed? While her brothers were orchestrating their elaborate revenge, while entire families were being destroyed and cities were falling into ruin, where was the voice of the woman at the center of it all? The scriptures fall into an almost deafening silence about Dinah's own thoughts, feelings, and desires. After that brief mention of her being taken from Shechem's house, she virtually disappears from the biblical narrative, as if her story was too dangerous, too complicated, too uncomfortable for the ancient writers to fully explore. This silence speaks volumes about the world. Dinah inhabited a world where women's experiences were often considered secondary to the honor and reputation of their male relatives. Her trauma, her potential feelings about Shechem, her thoughts about her brother's violent response, her fears about her future. all of these deeply human elements are left to our imagination. The text treats her almost like an object around which events swirl, rather than a person with agency, emotions, and a continuing story. Imagine for a moment what Dinah might have experienced during those days in Shechem's house. Was she held against her will? Or had she developed complex feelings about her situation? Had Shechem's professed love and tender words begun to affect her? Did she fear for her life? Or had she begun to envision a different future than the one her family had planned for her? These questions may seem inappropriate or uncomfortable to modern readers, but they reflect the harsh realities of ancient life, where survival often meant adapting to circumstances beyond one's control. The psychological impact of sexual violence in the ancient world was compounded by social stigma and limited options for victims. Dinah would have known that her value in the marriage market had been forever altered, that whispers would follow her wherever she went, that potential suitors might view her as damaged goods, even if none of what happened was her fault. The shame and blame would have fallen heavily upon her shoulders in a way that seems almost incomprehensible to contemporary sensibilities. But there's another layer to consider in this complex narrative. What if Dinah had begun to care for Shechem despite the violent beginning of their relationship? Trauma bonding is a well-documented psychological phenomenon where victims develop emotional attachments to their abusers, especially when those abusers subsequently show kindness or affection. Shechem's tender words and genuine desire to marry her might have created confusion in Dinah's mind, making her situation even more emotionally complicated. This possibility makes her brother's actions even more morally ambiguous. If Dinah had developed feelings for Shechem, if she had begun to see marriage to him as a path forward, then their rescue might have felt more like another violation of her autonomy. The text doesn't tell us whether they consulted her about their plans, whether they asked what she wanted, or whether they simply assumed they knew what was best for her. The silence suggests that her voice was not considered relevant to the decisions being made about her life. The cultural context makes this even more tragic. In the ancient Near East, women had virtually no legal rights. They couldn't own property, couldn't initiate divorce, couldn't choose their own husbands, and couldn't speak for themselves in legal matters. They were considered property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands, and their value was measured primarily by their ability to produce legitimate heirs. This system left women like Dinah incredibly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, while simultaneously denying them any meaningful recourse when such abuse occurred. Yet despite this oppressive system, there are hints throughout ancient literature that women found ways to exercise agency and influence, even within these constraints. They formed networks of support. They passed down wisdom through generations. They found subtle ways to shape family decisions. And they preserved stories that might otherwise have been lost. The fact that Dinah's story survived at all suggests that it mattered to someone, that her experience was deemed important enough to preserve, even if it was uncomfortable and controversial. The revenge taken by Simeon and Levi reveals another disturbing aspect of ancient honor culture. The idea that a woman's violation could only be cleansed by blood, that the shame brought upon a family could only be washed away through violence. This mindset treated women's bodies as battlegrounds for male honor, rather than recognizing them as autonomous individuals deserving of protection and respect. It reduced Dinah to a symbol rather than treating her as a person with her own rights and dignity. The brothers' question to their father, "Should he treat our sister like a harlot?" reveals the binary thinking that dominated their world in their minds. There were only two categories of women, those who were protected and pure, and those who were available and degraded. They couldn't conceive of a middle ground where a woman might be victimized, but still retain her dignity, where she might be violated, but still deserve respect and consideration. Their worldview demanded extreme responses to preserve family honor. This binary thinking had devastating consequences, not just for Dinah, but for the entire region. The massacre at Shechem sent shockwaves throughout Canaan, establishing Jacob's family as dangerous and unpredictable neighbors, Other tribes and cities would have heard the story and drawn conclusions about what it meant to cross this clan. The violence solved one immediate problem, but created countless others, making future peaceful coexistence more difficult. The economic and social ramifications extended far beyond the immediate aftermath. The plundering of Shechem brought wealth to Jacob's family, but at an enormous moral cost. They had enriched themselves through violence and deception, taking the possessions of people they had murdered and enslaved. This ill-gotten wealth would have carried a stain that affected how they saw themselves and how others saw them for generations to come. Jacob's own response to the situation reveals the impossible position he found himself in as a father and a leader. He was caught between his love for his daughter, his concern for his family's survival, and his moral convictions. He couldn't condone what Shechem had done to Dinah, but he also couldn't approve of the extreme violence his sons had used. In response, he was forced to navigate between competing loyalties and values with no clear path forward. The lasting impact on Jacob's family structure cannot be understated. The violence at Shechem created fractures that would persist for generations. Simeon and Levi had acted independently of their father's authority, establishing a precedent for sons to take matters into their own hands when they felt family honor was at stake. This would contribute to future conflicts within the family and complicate Jacob's efforts to maintain unity among his children. But perhaps most tragically, the focus on honor and revenge overshadowed any consideration of what Dinah herself might have needed or wanted in the aftermath of her trauma. There's no mention of efforts to help her heal, no discussion of her emotional state, no consideration of her preferences for her future. The men in her life were so focused on defending their honor that they forgot to care for the actual person who had been harmed. The silence surrounding Dinah's later life raises haunting questions. Did she ever marry? Did she have children? Did she find happiness? Or did she live out her days as a tragic figure, whose story served as a warning to other young women about the dangers of seeking connection outside their family's protective boundaries? The absence of these details leaves us with an incomplete picture of a woman who deserved so much more than to be remembered primarily as the catalyst for violence. This pattern of women disappearing from biblical narratives after traumatic events reflects broader cultural attitudes about female worth and agency. Once a woman had served her narrative purpose, whether as victim catalyst or symbol, she often faded from the historical record as if her continuing existence was no longer relevant to the larger story being told. This literary pattern reinforces the dehumanizing aspects of ancient patriarchal culture. Yet there's something powerful about the fact that Dinah's story was preserved at all in a culture that often ignored women's experiences entirely. Someone thought this story mattered enough to record and transmit it through generations. Perhaps it was preserved as a cautionary tale about the dangers of cultural mixing. Or perhaps it survived because it captured something essential about the human condition. The way trauma ripples through families and communities, creating cycles of pain and violence that can persist for generations. The theological implications of Dinah's story are equally complex. If Jacob's family was chosen by God to be the foundation of a great nation, what does it mean that they were capable of such violence and deception if they were meant to be a blessing to all nations? How do we reconcile that calling with their treatment of the people of Shechem? These questions force us to grapple with the reality that divine election doesn't guarantee moral perfection, and that God's plans often work through flawed and broken people. Modern readers struggle with this narrative because it challenges our assumptions about justice, morality, and the treatment of women. We want clear heroes and villains, simple moral lessons, and satisfying resolutions. But Dinah's story offers none of these comforts. Instead, it presents us with a complex web of trauma, violence, cultural conflict, and moral ambiguity that resists easy interpretation or comfortable conclusions. Perhaps that's exactly why her story matters so much. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and violence that remain relevant today. It challenges us to think more deeply about how we respond to injustice, and whether our desire for revenge sometimes creates more harm than healing. It reminds us that behind every act of violence are real people with complex emotions and continuing lives that extend far beyond the moment of crisis. The questions raised by Dinah's story become even more pressing when we consider how similar situations unfold in our modern world. How often do we see women's voices silenced in the aftermath of violence? How frequently are decisions made about their lives without consulting their wishes? How many times does the desire for justice or revenge overshadow the actual needs of those who have been harmed? These patterns persist across cultures and centuries, suggesting that the dynamics revealed in Dinah's story touch on something fundamental about human nature and social structures. What makes her disappearance from the narrative even more tragic is that it occurs at the very moment when her perspective would have been most valuable after the massacre at Shechem, after her rescue from what may have been captivity or what might have been a complicated relationship. She vanishes from the text, just when we most need to hear her voice. What did she think about her brother's actions? Did she feel grateful for their intervention, or horrified by their violence? Did she mourn for Shechem, despite everything that had happened between them? The absence of her voice forces us to confront how often women's experiences are filtered through the perspectives of the men around them, rather than being told in their own words. Dinah's story is narrated entirely by others. Her father's concerns, her brother's anger, Shechem's desires, but never her own thoughts, feelings, or choices. This narrative structure mirrors the social reality of her time, where women's experiences were considered less important than men's reactions to those experiences. Yet within this silence, there may be a different kind of testimony. The very fact that the story feels incomplete, that we hunger for more details about Dinah's inner life, suggests that even ancient audiences may have recognized something was missing. The discomfort we feel at her disappearance might reflect an awareness that existed even then, that women's stories mattered in ways that weren't always acknowledged or recorded. The ripple effects of the Shechem massacre would continue to influence Jacob's family long after the immediate crisis had passed. The wealth they had plundered would sustain them through difficult times, but it would also serve as a constant reminder of the violence through which it had been obtained. Every piece of gold, every animal, every household item carried with it the memory of the families that had been destroyed to obtain it. This material reminder of their actions would have created ongoing psychological and spiritual burdens. Moreover, the reputation they had gained as a violent and unpredictable clan would affect their relationships with other peoples throughout the region. Future negotiations for land-water rights or marriage alliances would be complicated by the memory of what had happened at Shechem. Other families would have to weigh the potential benefits of association with Jacob's prosperous household against the risks of becoming entangled with people capable of such extreme responses to perceived slights. The impact on Jacob himself appears to have been profound. His reaction to his son's actions reveals a man caught between competing loyalties and values. He couldn't publicly condemn what they had done, because that would have meant abandoning his daughter and appearing weak to his enemies. But he also couldn't fully endorse their methods, because he understood the broader consequences of their violence. This internal conflict would have created lasting tension within the family structure. Years later, when Jacob was on his deathbed, giving his final blessings to his sons, the memory of Shechem would resurface in his words to Simeon. And Levi, he would speak of their violence as a defining characteristic, cursing their anger and declaring that they would be scattered among the tribes of Israel. This deathbed pronouncement suggests that the events at Shechem had fundamentally altered how Jacob viewed these two sons and their place in the family legacy. The prophecy about Simeon and Levi being scattered would indeed come to pass in ways that reflected the complex consequences of their actions. The tribe of Simeon would eventually be absorbed into the territory of Judah, losing its independent identity, while the Levites would be dispersed throughout Israel as priests and temple servants. Their scattering could be seen as both punishment and purpose. They would serve important religious functions, but never have a consolidated homeland of their own. But what of the broader implications for Jacob's mission as the father of what would become the nation of Israel? How do we reconcile the calling to be a blessing to all nations with the destruction of an entire city? How do we understand God's covenant promises? In light of such violence, these questions force us to grapple with the tension between divine election and human moral failure, between calling and character. Some scholars have suggested that the story serves as a critique of vigilante justice, showing the devastating consequences that can follow when individuals take the law into their own hands, rather than seeking proper legal or divine resolution. The complete destruction of Shechem's city goes far beyond proportionate response, revealing how quickly the desire for justice can transform into something much darker and more destructive. Others have interpreted the narrative as a commentary on the dangers of cultural assimilation and intermarriage between different peoples in this reading. Dinah's initial desire to visit the women of the land represents the temptation to abandon one's distinct identity and values in favor of broader cultural acceptance. The tragic consequences that follow serve as a warning about the costs of such cultural mixing. Yet another interpretation focuses on the theme of honor and shame in ancient societies, suggesting that the story reveals both the power and the problems inherent in honor-based cultures. While the brothers' desire to defend their sister's honor is understandable and even admirable, their extreme response demonstrates how honor cultures can perpetuate cycles of violence that ultimately harm everyone involved, including those they claim to protect. The question of Shechem's character adds another layer of complexity to the story. Was he simply a violent predator who took what he wanted? Or was he a young man who made a terrible mistake and then genuinely tried to make amends through proper channels? His offer to pay any bride price and his willingness to have his entire city undergo circumcision suggest either sincere remorse or calculating manipulation. The text provides evidence for both interpretations. This ambiguity around Shechem's motivations makes the brother's response even more morally complex. If he was irredeemably evil, then their violence might be seen as necessary justice. But if he was capable of change and genuine repentance, then their actions represent a missed opportunity for reconciliation and healing. The story doesn't provide enough information to make a definitive judgment, leaving readers to wrestle with the uncertainty. The role of deception in the brothers' plan also raises important ethical questions. They used the sacred sign of circumcision as a weapon, turning a religious ritual into a tool of revenge. This manipulation of sacred symbols for violent purposes suggests a concerning willingness to corrupt holy things in service of personal vengeance. The fact that they were willing to deceive their enemies doesn't necessarily justify the means they employed. The economic motivations underlying the conflict cannot be ignored. Either Hamar's proposal for intermarriage and trade agreements wasn't just about his son's relationship with Dinah. It was about creating economic partnerships that would benefit both communities. The brothers' violent response destroyed not only lives, but also potential prosperity for their own family and the broader region. Their actions prioritized honor over practical advantage. The aftermath of the massacre would have created a refugee crisis, as the survivors of Shechem fled to other cities, carrying with them stories of what Jacob's family had done. These refugees would have served as living testimonies to the violence, spreading fear and hostility toward Jacob's clan throughout the region. The humanitarian consequences of the brothers' actions extended far beyond the immediate victims. Within Jacob's own family, the events would have created lasting trauma, not just for Dinah, but for everyone who witnessed or participated in the violence. The younger brothers who helped plunder the city would have been exposed to scenes of death and destruction that could have affected them for the rest of their lives. The normalization of extreme violence as a response to family honor would have influenced how they approached conflicts throughout their lives. The wives and children of Jacob's sons would also have been affected by the aftermath, living with the knowledge that their family was capable of such violence and dealing with the social isolation that resulted from their fearsome reputation. The women in particular might have identified with Dinah's victimization and felt additional vulnerability, knowing that their own safety depended on their male relatives' ability to protect them through force. The spiritual implications of the story are equally troubling. Jacob had built an altar at Shechem, calling it El Elohe Israel, meaning God, the God of Israel. But the violence that followed seemed to contradict everything that altar represented about peace covenant and divine blessing. The desecration of what should have been a holy place through bloodshed created a spiritual crisis that went beyond the immediate moral questions. The contrast between Jacob's earlier encounters with God and the violence at Shechem is stark. Jacob had wrestled with an angel and been blessed. He had received divine promises and experienced miraculous protection. Yet his family was capable of deception and mass murder. This disconnect between spiritual calling and moral behavior reflects the ongoing struggle between divine purpose and human weakness that runs throughout biblical narrative. The silence of God during these events is also noteworthy. Unlike other crises in Jacob's life, there's no record of divine intervention guidance or commentary on what happened at Shechem. This absence of divine voice leaves the moral evaluation entirely to human judgment, forcing readers to wrestle with the ethical implications without clear divine guidance or approval. Perhaps most significantly, the story reveals how violence against women can become a catalyst for broader conflicts that extend far beyond the original victim. Dinah's assault triggered a chain of events that resulted in the destruction of an entire community, the displacement of survivors, and lasting damage to her family's relationships with their neighbors. Her personal trauma became the spark for a much larger conflagration. This pattern of women's suffering being transformed into male violence is unfortunately common throughout history and literature. Women become symbols around which men fight wars, defend honor, and establish dominance. But the actual women at the center of these conflicts often disappear from view, their ongoing needs and desires subsumed into larger narratives about power and prestige. The story challenges us to consider how we respond to injustice in our own time when we witness or experience violation. Do we seek proportionate justice, or do we allow our anger to drive us toward excessive responses? Do we consider the broader consequences of our actions, or do we focus solely on immediate satisfaction? The brothers' example serves as both inspiration and warning about the complexities of seeking justice in an unjust world. Modern discussions about sexual violence and its aftermath can learn from the tensions revealed in Dinah's story. The desire to protect and defend victims is natural and necessary, but the methods we choose and the voices we center in our responses matter enormously. Ensuring that survivors maintain agency in their own healing process, while also holding perpetrators accountable, requires careful balance and ongoing attention to the actual needs of those who have been harmed. The economic dimensions of the conflict also speak to contemporary issues about how violence affects entire communities, when powerful families or groups resort to extreme measures to defend their interests. The consequences ripple outward, affecting innocent people who had no involvement in the original conflict. The plundering of Shechem enriched Jacob's family, but impoverished an entire region, creating lasting economic inequality. The story's treatment of cultural difference and religious identity remains relevant in our increasingly diverse world. The brothers' use of circumcision as both a test and a trap reveals how religious and cultural markers can be weaponized in conflicts between different groups. Their actions transformed what should have been a bridge between communities into a tool of destruction and death. Ultimately, Dinah's story refuses to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions. It presents us with a complex web of trauma violence, cultural conflict, and moral ambiguity that resists simple interpretation. The absence of her voice in the latter part of the narrative becomes itself a form of testimony about how women's experiences are often marginalized, even in stories that center on violence against them. Her disappearance from the text forces us to acknowledge how much we don't know about the experiences of women in ancient times, and how often their stories have been filtered through male perspectives and priorities. Yet the very fact that her story was preserved suggests that someone recognized its importance, even if they couldn't or wouldn't tell it completely. The questions raised by her narrative continue to resonate across centuries and cultures, challenging us to think more deeply about justice, violence, gender, and power. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social structures, while also inspiring us to imagine better ways of responding to injustice and supporting those who have been harmed. The questions that haunt us about Dinah's fate become even more pressing when we consider what the ancient world held for unmarried women, especially those who had experienced what she had endured. In a society where a woman's entire future depended on marriage and childbearing, where her security and social standing were tied directly to her relationship with a husband, what options remained for someone in Dinah's position? The brutal reality is that her choices would have been devastatingly limited, her path forward fraught with obstacles that no young woman should have to navigate alone. Consider the practical implications of her situation. After the massacre at Shechem, after the bloodshed and the plundering, after the entire region had learned of the violence committed in her name, what man would dare to seek her hand in marriage? What family would risk association with Jacob's clan through matrimonial alliance with the daughter who had been at the center of such destruction? The very actions meant to defend her honor may have inadvertently sealed her fate as unmarriageable, condemned to a life of perpetual dependence on her father's household. But there's another possibility that the text hints at without explicitly stating. Some ancient traditions and rabbinic commentaries suggest that Dinah may have given birth to a child as a result of her encounter with Shechem. If this were true, it would add yet another layer of complexity to an already devastating situation. An unmarried woman with a child in the ancient Near East faced social ostracism that was almost complete. She would have been viewed as damaged goods, her child bearing the stigma of illegitimate birth, both of them relegated to the margins of society. The psychological impact of carrying such a burden would have been enormous. Imagine the weight of knowing that your brothers had destroyed an entire city, that hundreds of people had died, that families had been torn apart, all because of what had happened to you. The guilt, the shame, the confusion of emotions would have been almost unbearable. Did she blame herself for going out to see the women of the land? Did she wonder if she could have prevented the violence that followed? Did she carry the weight of all those deaths on her conscience? Ancient Near Eastern literature provides glimpses into how societies dealt with women in situations similar to Dinah's. Some became temple prostitutes, dedicating their lives to religious service in a way that provided some measure of protection and purpose. Others were relegated to the role of servants or concubines within their own families, cared for, but never granted the dignity of full membership in society. Still others simply disappeared from the historical record, their lives deemed too inconsequential to merit documentation. The absence of any mention of Dinah's later life in the biblical narrative could itself be significant. In a culture that traced genealogies meticulously, that recorded births and deaths and marriages with careful attention, the silence surrounding her fate speaks volumes. It suggests either that her story was too painful for the family to discuss, too controversial for the scribes to record, or too tragic for the community to remember. Yet there are hints in later Jewish tradition that suggest Dinah's story didn't end in obscurity and despair. Some rabbinic sources claim that she eventually married Job, the righteous man, whose story of suffering and restoration is told in another biblical book. While these traditions cannot be verified historically, they represent an attempt by later generations to provide closure to a story that seemed incomplete, to imagine a future for a woman who had suffered so much. The idea that Dinah might have found happiness and purpose later in life, that she might have experienced love and fulfillment despite her traumatic beginning, offers a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dark narrative. It suggests that the ancient storytellers, even if they couldn't or wouldn't include these details in the official record, recognized that every person deserves a chance at redemption and renewal. But we must also consider the possibility that Dinah's silence in the text is not accidental, but intentional. Perhaps her voice was deliberately suppressed because it would have complicated the moral narrative that the storytellers wanted to convey. If she had forgiven Shechem, if she had opposed her brother's violent response, if she had chosen a different path than the one her family demanded, her perspective might have undermined the clear moral lines that the story seemed to draw. The patriarchal nature of ancient society meant that women's voices were often seen as potentially disruptive to social order. A woman who spoke out against male authority, who questioned the decisions made by her father and brothers, who dared to express her own desires and preferences, could be viewed as dangerous to the stability of the family and community. Dinah's silence might represent not just literary omission, but active censorship of a perspective that was deemed too threatening to preserve. This interpretation gains credibility when we consider how other biblical women who spoke up or acted independently were often portrayed negatively or had their stories marginalized. The pattern suggests a systematic tendency to suppress female voices that didn't conform to expected roles and behaviors. Dinah's disappearance from the narrative fits this pattern perfectly, leaving us to wonder what truths might have been lost along with her voice. The impact of her story on future generations of women in Jacob's family cannot be underestimated. Her daughters-in-law, her nieces, her granddaughters would have grown up knowing what had happened to Dinah. They would have learned from her example about the dangers of venturing beyond the protection of their male relatives, about the consequences of attracting unwanted attention, about the price of being a woman in a world controlled by men. This cautionary tale would have shaped their behavior, their choices, their understanding of their place in the world. They would have learned to be more cautious, more fearful, more dependent on male protection. In this way, Dinah's trauma would have echoed through generations, affecting women who never knew her, but who lived in the shadow of her story. The economic consequences of the Shechem massacre continued to reverberate through Jacob's family for years. The wealth they had plundered provided temporary prosperity, but it came at the cost of their reputation and their relationships with neighboring peoples. Future trade negotiations would be complicated by the memory of their violence. Potential allies would hesitate to trust a family capable of such deception and brutality. Jacob himself seemed to understand these implications, which may explain his concern about the practical consequences of his son's actions. As the head of a semi-nomadic clan, dependent on the goodwill of settled peoples for water rights, grazing privileges, and trade opportunities, he knew that their violent reputation could make survival much more difficult. The short-term satisfaction of revenge had to be weighed against the long-term costs of isolation and hostility. The psychological trauma experienced by Jacob's sons who participated in the massacre should not be overlooked either. While the text focuses on Simeon and Levi as the instigators, other brothers were involved in the plundering that followed. These young men would have been exposed to scenes of death and destruction that could have affected them for the rest of their lives. The normalization of extreme violence as a response to family honor would have influenced their approach to conflict resolution throughout their lives. The story also reveals the dangerous power of group psychology and mob mentality. What began as the justified anger of two brothers quickly escalated into a coordinated attack involving multiple family members. The transformation of righteous indignation into murderous rage demonstrates how quickly moral clarity can be lost when emotions run high and group dynamics take over. The use of religious symbolism in the brothers' deception adds another disturbing dimension to the story. Circumcision was not just a physical procedure, but a sacred covenant sign, a mark of dedication to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By using this holy ritual as a weapon, by turning it into a tool of revenge, the brothers corrupted something that should have been pure and sacred. This manipulation of religious practices for violent purposes reveals a troubling willingness to weaponize faith itself. The reaction of the men of Shechem to the circumcision requirement also provides insight into the economic motivations underlying the conflict. They were willing to undergo a painful and culturally foreign procedure because they saw the potential benefits of alliance with Jacob's prosperous family. Their eagerness to agree to the terms suggests that economic considerations often trumped religious or cultural concerns in the ancient world. The aftermath of the massacre would have created a humanitarian crisis as survivors fled to neighboring cities. These refugees would have carried with them not only their grief and trauma, but also stories that would shape how other peoples viewed Jacob's family. The ripple effects of the violence extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating lasting hostility and fear throughout the region. Within Jacob's own household, the events at Shechem would have created divisions and tensions that persisted for years. Some family members might have supported Simeon and Levi's actions, viewing them as necessary to defend family honor. Others might have been horrified by the violence and its consequences. These differing perspectives would have created ongoing conflicts within the family structure. The wives of Jacob's sons would have been particularly affected by the aftermath. As women themselves, they might have identified with Dinah's victimization, while also fearing the violent tendencies they had witnessed in their husbands. They would have had to live with the knowledge that the men they had married were capable of extreme violence, and they would have worried about their own safety and that of their children. The children born into Jacob's family after the Shechem incident would have grown up in the shadow of this violence. They would have heard whispered stories about what had happened, learned about the fearsome reputation their family had acquired, and understood that they were both protected and endangered by their association with such a volatile clan. The spiritual implications of the story extend beyond the immediate moral questions to touch on fundamental issues about the nature of divine justice and human responsibility. If Jacob's family was chosen by God to be the foundation of a great nation, what does their capacity for such violence say about divine election? How do we reconcile the calling to be a blessing to all nations with the destruction of an entire city? These theological questions force us to grapple with the tension between divine purpose and human moral failure. The story suggests that God's plans can work through flawed and broken people, but it doesn't minimize the real harm caused by their actions. The preservation of this difficult narrative in Scripture seems to acknowledge that the path of faith is not always clear or morally unambiguous. The contrast between Jacob's spiritual experiences and his family's violent actions is particularly striking. This was the man who had wrestled with an angel, who had received divine promises, who had built altars and experienced miraculous protection. Yet his household was capable of deception, mass murder, and the corruption of sacred symbols. This disconnect reveals the ongoing struggle between spiritual calling and human weakness that characterizes much of biblical narrative. The absence of divine commentary on the events at Shechem is also significant. Unlike other crises in Jacob's life, there's no record of God speaking into this situation, no divine judgment or approval, no miraculous intervention. This silence leaves the moral evaluation entirely to human discernment, forcing readers to wrestle with the ethical implications without clear divine guidance. Perhaps this absence of divine voice is itself part of the story's message. Maybe we're meant to understand that there are situations where human beings must take responsibility for their own moral choices, where we cannot rely on direct divine intervention to resolve complex ethical dilemmas. The story challenges us to develop our own moral reasoning and to accept the consequences of our decisions. The long-term impact of the Shechem massacre on the development of Israelite identity and culture cannot be underestimated. This early experience of violence and its consequences would have shaped how Jacob's descendants understood themselves and their relationship with other peoples. The memory of what happened would have influenced their approach to conflict resolution, their attitudes toward intermarriage, and their understanding of justice and revenge. The story also provides insight into the development of honor-shame cultures and their impact on social behavior. The brothers' response to Dinah's assault was driven by concepts of family honor that prioritized collective reputation over individual well-being. This cultural framework would continue to influence Middle Eastern societies for millennia, creating patterns of behavior that persist to this day. The economic dimensions of the conflict reveal how violence can disrupt entire regional systems of trade and cooperation. The destruction of Shechem didn't just affect the immediate victims, but damaged the broader economic network that connected various peoples and cities. The plundering that followed the massacre redistributed wealth through violence rather than trade, setting a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. The story's treatment of cultural and religious difference remains relevant for contemporary discussions about diversity and integration. The brothers' use of circumcision as both a test and a trap demonstrates how religious and cultural markers can be weaponized in conflicts between different groups. Their actions transformed what could have been a bridge between communities into an instrument of destruction. Modern readers often struggle with this narrative because it challenges comfortable assumptions about heroes and villains, about justice and morality, about the treatment of women and the resolution of conflicts. The story refuses to provide easy answers or satisfying conclusions, instead presenting us with a complex web of motivations, actions, and consequences that resist simple moral categorization. Yet perhaps this complexity is exactly what makes Dinah's story so important and enduring. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the ways violence can spiral out of control, about how good intentions can lead to devastating outcomes. It challenges us to think more deeply about justice, revenge, and the true costs of defending honor through violence. The story also serves as a powerful reminder about the importance of including women's voices in narratives about violence and its aftermath. Dinah's silence in the text becomes a form of testimony about how often women's experiences are marginalized, even in stories that center on violence against them. Her absence from the latter part of the narrative forces us to acknowledge how much we don't know about the experiences of women in ancient times, and how their perspectives have been systematically excluded from historical records. In our contemporary context, Dinah's story speaks to ongoing issues about sexual violence, family honor, cultural conflict, and the treatment of survivors. It challenges us to consider how we respond to injustice, whether we truly center the needs and voices of those who have been harmed, and whether our desire for justice sometimes transforms into something darker and more destructive. The questions raised by her narrative continue to resonate across cultures and centuries, forcing us to grapple with fundamental issues about power, gender, violence, and human dignity. They inspire us to imagine better ways of responding to injustice, while also acknowledging the complex realities that make such responses difficult to achieve. Perhaps most importantly, Dinah's story reminds us that behind every act of violence, every political conflict, every historical event, are real people with complex emotions, continuing lives, and stories that deserve to be told. Her disappearance from the biblical narrative becomes itself a call to remember the forgotten, to listen for the silenced voices, and to recognize the humanity of those whose stories have been deemed too dangerous, too complicated, or too uncomfortable to preserve. The tragedy of Dinah's story becomes even more profound when we consider the broader implications for women throughout the generations that followed. Her experience would have served as a cautionary tale passed down through oral tradition, shaping the lives and choices of countless daughters who came after her. Every young woman in Jacob's lineage would have grown up knowing what happened to their ancestor, learning from her example about the precarious nature of female existence in a world where male honor took precedence over female agency. Think about the psychological impact this would have had on mothers raising daughters in Jacob's household. They would have looked at their own girls with a mixture of love and fear, knowing that despite all their protection and care, a single moment of vulnerability could lead to consequences that extended far beyond one person's life. The simple act of wanting to visit other women, to seek friendship and community beyond the confines of family, had resulted in bloodshed and destruction on an unimaginable scale. This creates a chilling parallel to modern discussions about victim blaming and the ways society often holds women responsible for violence committed against them. Dinah's desire to see the women of the land was natural, innocent, and entirely reasonable. Yet the narrative structure almost suggests that her decision to venture beyond her family's protection was the catalyst for everything that followed. This interpretation, while not explicitly stated in the text, would have been absorbed by generations of readers who learned to see women's independence as inherently dangerous. The ripple effects of this mindset cannot be overstated. How many women throughout history have been denied opportunities for growth, connection, and self-discovery because their families feared another Shechem? How many daughters were kept isolated and dependent not out of love, but out of terror that their freedom might bring destruction upon the entire household? Dinah's story became a prison for women who never even knew her name. But there's another dimension to consider here, one that speaks to the broader patterns of violence and retribution that have plagued human societies for millennia. The brothers' response to Dinah's assault established a precedent that would echo through countless generations. They demonstrated that perceived wrongs against family members could justify extreme violence, that honor could only be restored through blood, and that proportionality had no place in matters of family reputation. This mindset would go on to fuel blood feuds, clan wars, and cycles of vengeance that could persist for centuries. The logic was simple, yet devastating. Any attack on our family must be met with overwhelming force to ensure that others think twice before crossing us again. The problem with this approach is that it assumes violence can actually solve the underlying problems that create conflict in the first place. What the brothers failed to understand, or chose to ignore, was that their extreme response would create new enemies, new grievances, and new justifications for future violence. The survivors of Shechem didn't simply disappear into history. They carried their trauma, their anger, and their desire for revenge to other cities and other peoples. They became living testimonies to the brutality of Jacob's family, spreading fear and hostility throughout the region. The economic consequences of this reputation would have been severe and long-lasting. In the ancient world, trade relationships were built on trust and mutual benefit. Merchants needed to feel safe when traveling to conduct business. Cities needed assurance that diplomatic agreements would be honored. The massacre at Shechem sent a clear message that Jacob's family was willing to use deception and violence to achieve their goals, making them extremely dangerous partners in any enterprise. This isolation would have affected not just Jacob's generation, but his children and grandchildren as well. Opportunities for peaceful expansion, for beneficial marriages, for cultural exchange and learning would have been severely limited by the fearsome reputation they had acquired. The short-term satisfaction of revenge had created long-term consequences that would handicap the family for generations. The psychological toll on the perpetrators themselves is another aspect of this story that deserves attention. While the text focuses on the immediate aftermath of the violence, it doesn't explore the long-term impact on Simeon, Levi, and the other brothers who participated in the massacre. Taking human life, even in the name of justice, leaves lasting scars on those who commit such acts. Modern research on combat veterans and others who have been involved in violent conflicts reveals the profound psychological consequences that can follow such experiences. Post-traumatic stress, guilt, depression, and difficulty forming healthy relationships are common among those who have witnessed or participated in extreme violence. The brothers would have carried these burdens for the rest of their lives, affecting their ability to be good fathers, husbands, and community members. The normalization of violence within the family structure would have had particularly devastating effects on the next generation. Children who grow up in households where extreme violence is seen as an acceptable response to conflict often struggle to develop healthy coping mechanisms and relationship skills. They may become either perpetrators or victims of violence themselves, continuing the cycle that began with their parents' actions. Jacob's own response to the situation reveals the impossible position he found himself in as both a father and a leader. His immediate concern about the practical consequences of his son's actions suggests that he understood the broader implications of what they had done. Yet, his failure to address the moral dimensions of their behavior may have sent the wrong message to his other children about the acceptability of violence as a solution to family problems. The contrast between Jacob's spiritual experiences and his family's violent actions creates a profound theological tension that runs throughout this narrative. This was a man who had encountered God directly, who had received divine promises and experienced miraculous protection. Yet his household was capable of deception, mass murder, and the corruption of sacred symbols. How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory realities? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that divine election doesn't guarantee moral perfection, and that God's purposes can work through flawed and broken people without endorsing their actions. The preservation of this difficult story in Scripture seems to acknowledge that the path of faith is not always clear or morally unambiguous. It forces us to grapple with the reality that even those chosen by God can make terrible decisions with lasting consequences. The absence of divine intervention or commentary during the events at Shechem is particularly striking. Unlike other crises in Jacob's life, there's no record of God speaking into this situation, no miraculous resolution, no clear moral guidance from heaven. This silence leaves the ethical evaluation entirely to human judgment, forcing both the characters in the story and its readers to wrestle with complex moral questions without easy answers. This divine silence might itself be part of the story's message. Perhaps we're meant to understand that there are situations where human beings must take full responsibility for their moral choices, where we cannot rely on direct divine intervention to resolve ethical dilemmas. The story challenges us to develop our own moral reasoning and to accept the consequences of our decisions, even when those consequences are severe and long-lasting. The role of deception in the brothers' plan adds another layer of moral complexity to the narrative. They didn't simply attack Shechem in a moment of rage. They carefully planned their revenge, using the sacred sign of circumcision as a weapon and exploiting their enemies' trust to create vulnerability. This calculated approach to violence is perhaps even more disturbing than a crime of passion would have been. The corruption of religious symbols for violent purposes reveals a troubling willingness to weaponize faith itself. Circumcision was not just a physical procedure, but a covenant sign, a mark of dedication to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By using this holy ritual as a tool of deception and revenge, the brothers crossed a line that should have been sacred and inviolable. This manipulation of religious practices for violent ends has unfortunately been repeated throughout history, as various groups have used faith as a justification for aggression and brutality. The brothers' example serves as an early warning about how easily sacred symbols can be corrupted when they serve human purposes rather than divine ones. The eager agreement of Shechem's men to undergo circumcision reveals the powerful role that economic motivations played in this conflict. They were willing to endure pain and adopt foreign religious practices because they saw the potential benefits of alliance with Jacob's prosperous family. Their calculation proved tragically wrong, but it illustrates how material considerations often override cultural and religious concerns in human decision-making. The humanitarian crisis created by the massacre extends far beyond the immediate victims to include the women and children who were left widowed and orphaned by the violence. These survivors would have faced uncertain futures in a world where women and children without male protection were extremely vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The brothers' actions created new victims, even as they claimed to be defending one. The displacement of Shechem's survivors would have created ripple effects throughout the region as refugees sought shelter and support in neighboring cities. These displaced persons would have carried with them not only their immediate needs, but also their stories of what had happened, spreading fear and hostility toward Jacob's family across a wide area. Within Jacob's own household, the aftermath of Shechem would have created lasting divisions and tensions. Family members would have had to choose sides, deciding whether to support or condemn the actions of Simeon and Levi. These divisions would have affected relationships, decision-making, and the overall unity of the clan for years to come. The wives and daughters-in-law in Jacob's family would have been particularly affected by these events. As women themselves, they would have identified with Dinah's victimization, while also grappling with the knowledge that their own husbands and sons were capable of extreme violence. They would have lived with the constant awareness that their safety depended on the continued goodwill and protection of men who had proven themselves capable of mass murder. The psychological impact on the children in Jacob's household cannot be overlooked either. Those old enough to understand what had happened would have been traumatized by the violence and its aftermath. Younger children would have absorbed the tension and fear that permeated the family without fully understanding its source. All of them would have grown up knowing that their family was different, that they were feared and avoided by others because of actions taken before they were born. The long-term implications for the development of Israelite identity and culture are staggering to consider. This early experience of violence and its consequences would have shaped how Jacob's descendants understood themselves and their relationship with other peoples for generations. The memory of Shechem would have influenced their approach to conflict resolution, their attitudes toward intermarriage and cultural exchange, and their understanding of justice and proportional response. The story also provides disturbing insight into the development and perpetuation of honor-shame cultures. The brothers' response was driven by concepts of family honor that prioritized collective reputation over individual well-being, including the well-being of the very person they claimed to be defending. This cultural framework, once established, becomes self-perpetuating as each generation learns that their worth is tied to their family's reputation, and that any threat to that reputation must be met with overwhelming force. The economic dimensions of the conflict reveal how violence can disrupt entire regional systems of cooperation and mutual benefit. The destruction of Shechem didn't just affect the immediate victims, but damaged the broader network of relationships that connected various peoples and cities throughout Canaan. The trust necessary for peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity was shattered, creating a more dangerous and unpredictable environment for everyone. The story's treatment of cultural and religious difference remains painfully relevant for contemporary discussions about diversity, integration, and interfaith relations. The brothers' use of circumcision as both a test and a trap demonstrates how religious and cultural markers can be weaponized in conflicts between different groups. What should have been an opportunity for bridge building and mutual understanding was transformed into an instrument of destruction and death. Modern readers often struggle with this narrative precisely because it challenges comfortable assumptions about heroes and villains, about clear moral categories and satisfying resolutions. The story refuses to provide easy answers or comfortable conclusions, instead presenting us with a tangled web of motivations, actions, and consequences that resist simple ethical categorization. Yet this moral complexity may be exactly what makes Dinah's story so important and enduring. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the ways good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, about how the desire for justice can transform into something much darker and more destructive. It challenges us to think more deeply about the true costs of violence and the real meaning of justice in a broken world. The story serves as a powerful reminder about the critical importance of including women's voices and perspectives in narratives about violence and its aftermath. Dinah's silence in the text becomes a form of testimony about how often women's experiences are marginalized, overlooked, or simply deemed irrelevant to the larger story being told. Her absence forces us to acknowledge how much we don't know about the lived experiences of women throughout history and how their perspectives have been systematically excluded from the records that shape our understanding of the past. In our contemporary context, Dinah's story speaks directly to ongoing struggles with sexual violence, family honor, cultural conflict, and the treatment of survivors. It challenges us to examine our own responses to injustice, to consider whether we truly center the needs and voices of those who have been harmed, and to question whether our desire for justice sometimes transforms into something that creates more harm than healing. The questions raised by this ancient narrative continue to resonate across cultures and centuries, forcing us to grapple with fundamental issues about power, gender, violence, and human dignity. They inspire us to imagine better ways of responding to injustice, while also acknowledging the complex realities that make such responses difficult to achieve in practice. Perhaps most importantly, Dinah's story reminds us that behind every act of violence, every political conflict, every historical event that we study or discuss, are real people with complex emotions, ongoing lives, and stories that deserve to be told in their own words. Her disappearance from the biblical narrative becomes a call to remember the forgotten, to listen for the silenced voices, and to recognize the full humanity of those whose experiences have been deemed too dangerous, too complicated, or too uncomfortable to preserve in official records. The untold fate of Dinah challenges us to become better storytellers ourselves, to ensure that the voices of the marginalized and vulnerable are not lost to history, and to create space for the complex truths that don't fit neatly into our preferred narratives about heroes and villains, justice and revenge, faith and violence. Her silence speaks, and if we listen carefully, we might learn something essential about the human condition and our responsibility to one another, in a world where power too often determines whose stories get told and whose experiences matter enough to remember. The legacy of silence surrounding Dinah extends far beyond her own story into the very fabric of how we understand biblical narrative and historical memory. When we examine the genealogical records that follow her family's story, we find detailed accounts of her brothers' descendants, their territories, their accomplishments, and their failures. Yet Dinah remains frozen in time, forever the young woman who went out to see the women of the land, forever the catalyst for violence, never the fully realized person who continued living after the crisis had passed. This pattern of documentation reveals something profound about ancient priorities and values. The scribes who preserved these stories chose what to include and what to omit based on their understanding of what mattered for future generations. The fact that they included Dinah's story at all suggests its importance, but the fact that they truncated it so abruptly suggests deep discomfort with its implications and consequences. Consider what we do know about the women who are more fully documented in biblical narrative. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah all receive substantial attention because their stories serve clear purposes in the larger narrative of covenant and promise. Their lives are recorded in detail because they contributed directly to the genealogical line that would become the nation of Israel. But Dinah's story serves a different purpose entirely, one that the ancient editors may have found much more troubling to explore. Her narrative functions as a warning, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cultural mixing and the consequences of female independence. But it also reveals uncomfortable truths about the capacity for violence within the chosen family, the moral ambiguity of revenge, and the ways that women's trauma can be transformed into male narratives about honor and justice. These themes were apparently too complex, too disturbing, too theologically challenging to explore in depth. The psychological impact of this narrative truncation on readers throughout history cannot be underestimated. generations of women would have read or heard Dinah's story and internalized its implicit messages about female behavior and male protection. They would have learned that seeking connection beyond family boundaries was dangerous, that their choices could have catastrophic consequences for entire communities, and that their own voices and preferences were secondary to the honor and reputation of their male relatives. But there's another way to read this silence, one that may be more empowering for contemporary audiences. Perhaps Dinah's disappearance from the text represents not just editorial omission, but a kind of freedom. Maybe by refusing to define her completely, by leaving her fate unknown, the narrative creates space for readers to imagine alternative endings, different possibilities, hopeful futures that the ancient world might not have been ready to envision or record. This interpretive approach allows us to reclaim Dinah's agency in ways that the original text does not. We can imagine her finding healing and purpose despite her trauma. We can envision her developing relationships and experiences that transcended the violence done in her name. We can picture her as a fully realized person, whose life extended far beyond the moment of crisis that defined her in the biblical record. Some modern scholars and feminist theologians have embraced this approach, creating literature and commentary that gives Dinah the voice she was denied in Scripture. These works imagine her thoughts, feelings, and experiences in ways that honor both her suffering and her humanity. They refuse to let her remain trapped forever in the role of victim or symbol, instead portraying her as a complex individual capable of growth, healing, and meaningful existence. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize her situation or minimize the very real constraints that would have limited her options in the ancient world. The social, economic, and cultural realities of her time would have created genuine obstacles to independence, fulfillment, and self-determination that no amount of modern imagination can fully overcome. Her story remains tragic precisely because the world she inhabited offered so few possibilities for women to transcend the circumstances imposed upon them by others. The theological implications of Dinah's story continue to challenge readers who seek to understand God's purposes and character through biblical narrative. If Jacob's family was chosen to be a blessing to all nations, how do we reconcile that calling with their capacity for deception and mass murder? If they were meant to be examples of faith and righteousness, what does their violent response to injustice teach us about the nature of divine election and human responsibility? These questions become even more pressing when we consider that the violence at Shechem was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of morally ambiguous behavior that characterized Jacob's family throughout their history. From Abraham's deception about Sarah being his sister, to Isaac's favoritism between his sons, to Jacob's own manipulation of his father and brother, this family line was marked by complex moral choices that resist simple categorization as righteous or unrighteous. Perhaps this is precisely the point that the biblical editors wanted to preserve, even if they couldn't fully explore its implications. Maybe the inclusion of difficult stories like Dinah's serves to remind readers that God's purposes work through flawed human beings, that divine election doesn't guarantee moral perfection, and that the path of faith often involves wrestling with complex ethical dilemmas that have no clear or easy solutions. The story also raises profound questions about the nature of justice and the appropriate response to violence and oppression. The brothers' actions can be seen simultaneously as a justified defense of their sister's honor, and as a disproportionate response that created more harm than healing. This moral ambiguity forces readers to grapple with fundamental questions about revenge, proportionality, and the cycle of violence that can spiral out of control when emotions run high and group dynamics take over. Modern discussions about restorative versus retributive justice find a powerful case study in this ancient narrative. The brothers chose retribution, seeking to punish those who had harmed their sister through overwhelming violence. But their approach created new victims, new grievances, and new justifications for future conflict. It satisfied their immediate desire for revenge, but failed to address the underlying issues that had created the original problem. An alternative approach might have focused on restoration, seeking to repair the harm done to Dinah, while also addressing the broader cultural and social factors that had made such harm possible in the first place. This could have involved holding Shechem accountable for his actions, while also working to change the attitudes and structures that enabled powerful men to take what they wanted from vulnerable women without consequence. Of course, such an approach would have required a level of social and moral development that may not have been possible in the ancient world. The concept of restorative justice, with its emphasis on healing relationships and addressing root causes of harm, is largely a modern development that builds on centuries of moral and philosophical progress. We cannot fairly judge ancient peoples by contemporary standards, but we can learn from their experiences as we work to develop better responses to violence and injustice in our own time. The economic dimensions of the Shechem story also provide important insights into how violence affects entire communities and regions. The massacre didn't just destroy individual lives, but disrupted trade relationships, created refugee populations, and damaged the trust necessary for peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity. The short-term material gains from plundering the city were far outweighed by the long-term costs of isolation, hostility, and damaged reputation. This pattern of violence creating more problems than it solves is unfortunately common throughout human history. Communities that resort to extreme measures to defend their interests often find that their actions create new enemies, new grievances, and new cycles of conflict that can persist for generations. The immediate satisfaction of revenge gives way to the ongoing burden of living with the consequences of extreme actions. The story's treatment of cultural and religious difference remains painfully relevant for contemporary discussions about diversity, integration, and interfaith relations. The initial proposal for intermarriage and cultural exchange between Jacob's family and the people of Shechem represented a potential opportunity for mutual enrichment and peaceful coexistence. The brothers' use of religious differences as a weapon transformed what could have been a bridge between communities into an instrument of destruction. This pattern of weaponizing cultural and religious differences is unfortunately common in human conflicts throughout history. Groups that might otherwise coexist peacefully often find their differences exploited by those seeking to justify violence or advance their own interests. The brothers' manipulation of circumcision as both a test and a trap demonstrates how sacred symbols and practices can be corrupted when they serve human ambition rather than divine purpose. The role of women in this narrative extends beyond Dinah herself to include the wives, daughters, and mothers who were affected by the violence but whose voices are completely absent from the record. The women of Shechem who were widowed by the massacre, the daughters who were orphaned, the mothers who lost their sons. None of their experiences are documented or apparently considered relevant to the story being told. This systematic exclusion of women's perspectives and experiences reflects broader patterns in ancient historical writing that privileged male voices and male concerns, while treating women as secondary characters in their own lives. The consequences of this editorial approach extend far beyond individual narratives to shape our understanding of entire cultures, historical periods, and moral frameworks. Contemporary readers working to understand these ancient stories must grapple with the challenge of reading between the lines, of imagining the experiences and perspectives that were not deemed worthy of preservation by the original editors. This requires both historical sensitivity and creative imagination, as we seek to honor the complexity of human experience while acknowledging the limitations of our sources. The silence surrounding Dinah's later life becomes particularly poignant when we consider the ongoing impact that sexual violence has on survivors. Modern research has revealed the long-term psychological, emotional, and social consequences that can follow such trauma. Consequences that would have been poorly understood and inadequately addressed in the ancient world. Dinah would have needed support, healing, and ongoing care that her society was likely ill-equipped to provide. The absence of any mention of therapeutic intervention, counseling, or systematic support for trauma survivors in the biblical narrative reflects the limited understanding of psychological healing that characterized ancient cultures. People were expected to simply move forward from traumatic experiences without the benefit of professional help, or even widespread social acknowledgement of their ongoing needs. This creates additional layers of tragedy in Dinah's story, as she would have been forced to cope with her trauma in isolation, without the support systems and therapeutic resources that we now understand to be essential for healing. Her silence in the text may reflect not just editorial omission, but the very real silencing that trauma survivors experienced in cultures that lacked adequate frameworks for understanding and addressing psychological wounds. The impact of this story on subsequent generations of Jacob's family would have been profound and lasting. Children growing up in the household would have absorbed the lessons about violence, honor, and the treatment of women that were embedded in the family's response to Dinah's assault. These lessons would have shaped their understanding of appropriate behavior, acceptable responses to conflict, and the relative value of different family members. The normalization of extreme violence as a response to perceived slights would have created ongoing risks for the family and their neighbors. Future conflicts would have been viewed through the lens of the Shechem precedent, with family members potentially quick to resort to violent solutions when they felt their honor or interests were threatened. This pattern of learned behavior could have perpetuated cycles of violence that extended far beyond the original incident. The story also reveals the dangerous power of group psychology and the ways that individual moral reasoning can be overwhelmed by collective emotions and loyalties. What began as the justified anger of two brothers quickly escalated into a coordinated attack involving multiple family members, with each participant likely feeling that their actions were justified by the group dynamic and the perceived righteousness of their cause. This phenomenon of moral disengagement in group settings has been documented extensively in modern psychological research, which shows how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary violence when they feel supported by their group and convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The brothers' actions at Shechem provide an early example of how group loyalty and collective emotion can override individual moral judgment. The use of deception in the brothers' plan adds another layer of moral complexity that continues to trouble readers seeking to understand the ethical dimensions of this story. Their careful planning and calculated manipulation of their enemy's trust reveals a level of premeditation that makes their actions even more disturbing than a crime of passion might have been. The corruption of religious symbols and practices for violent purposes represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of the entire narrative. Circumcision was not merely a cultural practice, but a sacred covenant sign that connected Jacob's family to their God and to their ancestors. By using this holy ritual as a weapon of deception, the brothers crossed a line that should have been inviolable. This manipulation of sacred symbols for violent ends has unfortunately been repeated throughout history, as various groups have used religious faith as a justification for aggression and brutality. The brothers' example serves as an early warning about the dangers of corrupting holy things for human purposes, of allowing earthly concerns to override divine commands and moral principles. The eager agreement of Shechem's men to undergo circumcision reveals the powerful role that economic calculations played in their decision-making process. They were willing to endure pain and adopt foreign religious practices because they saw the potential material benefits of alliance with Jacob's prosperous family. Their tragic miscalculation illustrates how material considerations can blind people to other important factors in making life-changing decisions. The humanitarian consequences of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims to create ripple effects throughout the entire region. The destruction of a city created refugees, disrupted trade networks, and damaged the relationships of trust that were essential for peaceful coexistence among the various peoples of Canaan. These broader consequences of violence are often overlooked in discussions that focus primarily on the immediate moral questions raised by the brothers' actions. But the story demonstrates how individual choices, especially those involving violence and deception, can have far-reaching implications that affect entire communities and regions for generations. The psychological toll on the perpetrators themselves represents another dimension of this story that deserves careful consideration. While the text focuses on the immediate aftermath of the violence, it doesn't explore the long-term impact on Simeon, Levi, and the other family members who participated in the massacre. Modern research on combat veterans and others who have been involved in violent conflicts reveals the profound psychological consequences that can follow such experiences. The brothers would have carried the weight of their actions for the rest of their lives, affecting their relationships, their mental health, and their ability to function as productive members of their community. The normalization of violence within the family structure would have had particularly devastating effects on the next generation, as children learned that extreme responses to conflict were not only acceptable, but sometimes necessary to defend family honor. This pattern of learned behavior could have perpetuated cycles of violence that extended far beyond the original incident. Jacob's own response to his son's actions reveals the impossible position he found himself in, as both a father, trying to protect his daughter, and a leader responsible for his entire clan's survival and reputation. His immediate concern about the practical consequences of their violence suggests that he understood the broader implications of what they had done, even if he couldn't bring himself to condemn their motivations. The tension between Jacob's spiritual experiences and his family's capacity for violence creates a theological puzzle that has challenged readers for thousands of years. How do we reconcile divine election with human moral failure? How do we understand God's purposes working through people capable of such extreme actions? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that the biblical narrative doesn't present its characters as moral exemplars, but as complex human beings struggling to live faithfully in a broken world. The preservation of difficult stories like Dinah's serves to remind us that the path of faith is often marked by moral ambiguity, difficult choices, and unintended consequences that extend far beyond our immediate intentions. The absence of divine commentary or intervention during the events at Shechem is particularly striking, given God's active involvement in other aspects of Jacob's life. This silence forces readers to grapple with the moral dimensions of the story without clear divine guidance, challenging us to develop our own ethical reasoning and to accept responsibility for the consequences of our choices. This divine silence may itself carry important theological meaning, suggesting that there are situations where human beings must take full responsibility for their moral decisions without relying on direct heavenly intervention. The story challenges us to develop mature moral reasoning, while also acknowledging the complex realities that make ethical decision-making so difficult in practice. As we continue to wrestle with Dinah's story and its implications, we're forced to confront fundamental questions about justice, violence, gender, and power that remain painfully relevant in our contemporary world. Her silence in the biblical narrative becomes a call for us to listen more carefully to the voices that are marginalized or overlooked in our own time, to center the experiences of those who have been harmed, and to work toward forms of justice that heal rather than simply punish. The untold fate of Dinah reminds us that behind every historical event, every political conflict, every act of violence are real people whose full stories deserve to be known and remembered. Her disappearance from the text challenges us to become better storytellers ourselves, to create space for the complex truths that don't fit neatly into our preferred narratives, and to ensure that the voices of the vulnerable are not lost to history. The questions that emerge from Dinah's vanishing become even more urgent when we consider the patterns of silence that have persisted throughout history, patterns that continue to shape how we understand trauma, justice, and the voices that matter in our collective memory. Her story forces us to confront a disturbing reality, that the most vulnerable among us often disappear from the narrative precisely when their perspectives would be most valuable. most necessary, most transformative. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in the tents of Jacob's family in the months and years following the massacre at Shechem. Picture the whispered discussions between mothers and daughters, the careful warnings passed down through generations, the unspoken fears that shaped every decision about where young women could go, whom they could see, what freedoms they could safely enjoy. Dinah's experience became a template, a cautionary tale that would influence the lives of countless women who came after her. But what if we've been reading this silence all wrong? What if Dinah's disappearance from the biblical record wasn't just about ancient editorial decisions or cultural limitations? What if her absence speaks to something even more profound about the nature of survival, resilience, and the ways that people rebuild their lives after unimaginable trauma? Consider this possibility. Perhaps Dinah chose her own silence. Perhaps after experiencing violence, after watching her brothers respond with even greater violence, after seeing an entire city destroyed in her name, she decided that the only way to reclaim any sense of agency was to step away from the narrative entirely. Maybe her disappearance represents not abandonment by the storytellers, but a deliberate choice to live beyond the confines of other people's interpretations of her life. This reading transforms her silence from a symbol of oppression into an act of resistance. Instead of remaining forever trapped in the role of victim or catalyst for violence, she removes herself from the story, refusing to be defined by the worst thing that happened to her, or the terrible things done in her name. Her absence becomes a form of liberation, a way of asserting that her life was larger, more complex, more meaningful than the crisis that brought her to historical attention. But even if we embrace this more empowering interpretation, we cannot ignore the systemic issues that her story reveals about how societies have traditionally responded to violence against women. The pattern is depressingly familiar. A woman is harmed, men respond with their own violence, and then the original victim disappears from consideration as the focus shifts to the actions and consequences faced by the men involved. This dynamic transforms women from autonomous individuals into symbols, objects around which male honor and power are negotiated. Their actual needs, desires, and perspectives become secondary to the larger narratives about family reputation, cultural conflict, and the appropriate responses to perceived insults. The woman at the center of it all becomes almost incidental to her own story. The psychological complexity of trauma bonding adds another layer to our understanding of why Dinah's story might have been too complicated for ancient storytellers to fully explore. If she had developed conflicted feelings about Shechem, if she had experienced moments of genuine care or affection despite the violence of their initial encounter, if she had found herself torn between loyalty to her family and other emotions she couldn't fully understand or express, her internal experience would have challenged simple moral categories. Ancient audiences, like modern ones, often prefer clear heroes and villains, straightforward moral lessons, and satisfying resolutions. A story in which the victim's feelings were ambiguous, in which the perpetrator showed genuine remorse and change, in which the family's violent response created more problems than it solved, would have been deeply unsettling and difficult to process. Yet these are precisely the kinds of complex realities that survivors of violence often face. The human psyche's capacity to find connection and meaning, even in traumatic circumstances, to develop complicated relationships with those who have caused harm, to experience conflicting emotions about rescue and revenge, reflects the resilience and adaptability that allows people to survive impossible situations. The economic ramifications of the Shechem massacre continued to reverberate through the region for generations. The destruction of a prosperous city didn't just eliminate immediate trading partners. It sent a message to other communities about the risks of close association with Jacob's family. Future negotiations would be conducted with the knowledge that these people were capable of extreme deception and violence when they felt their honor had been threatened. This reputation for volatility would have made it much more difficult for Jacob's descendants to establish the kinds of stable, long-term relationships that were essential for prosperity in the ancient world. Merchants would have been reluctant to travel to their territory. Neighboring cities would have been cautious about diplomatic engagements, and potential marriage alliances would have been complicated by concerns about the family's violent tendencies. The irony is that the brothers' actions, taken to defend their family's honor and ensure their sister's dignity, may have actually made their entire clan more vulnerable and isolated. Their extreme response to one act of violence created conditions that made future violence more likely, not less. They had demonstrated their willingness and ability to respond with overwhelming force, but they had also shown that they were unpredictable and dangerous neighbors. The psychological impact on Jacob himself deserves deeper consideration. As a father, he would have been torn between pride in his son's loyalty to their sister and horror at the scope of their violence. As a leader, he would have understood the practical consequences of their actions, while also recognizing that condemning them too harshly might undermine his authority and their family's unity. This internal conflict would have created lasting stress and tension within the family structure. Jacob's attempts to balance his various roles and responsibilities would have been complicated by the knowledge that his sons were capable of acting independently and violently when they felt family honor was at stake. His authority as patriarch had been both reinforced and undermined by their actions. The religious implications of using circumcision as a weapon of deception cannot be overstated. This wasn't simply a matter of practical strategy, it was the corruption of a sacred covenant sign for violent purposes. The brothers had taken something that was meant to represent dedication to God and transformed it into an instrument of revenge and death. This violation of sacred symbols would have created spiritual as well as practical consequences for the family. How could they continue to view circumcision as a holy sign after using it to facilitate mass murder? How could they maintain their covenant relationship with God after corrupting one of its most fundamental expressions? These questions would have haunted them for years, affecting their religious practices and their understanding of their divine calling. The broader theological implications extend to fundamental questions about the nature of divine election and human moral responsibility. If Jacob's family was chosen by God to be the foundation of a great nation, what does their capacity for such violence say about divine judgment and human nature? How do we reconcile the calling to be a blessing to all nations with the destruction of an entire city? These questions force us to grapple with the tension between divine purpose and human freedom, between calling and character, between election and moral behavior. The story suggests that God's plans can work through flawed and broken people, but it doesn't minimize the real harm caused by their actions or excuse their moral failures. The pattern of violence and revenge established at Shechem would echo through subsequent generations of Jacob's family and their descendants. The precedent that family honor could justify extreme violence, that perceived wrongs must be met with overwhelming force, that deception was acceptable when serving righteous purposes would influence decision-making for centuries to come. This cultural legacy of honor-based violence has persisted in various forms throughout human history, creating cycles of conflict that can span generations and devastate entire regions. The logic is always the same. Our family, our tribe, our nation has been wronged, and only blood can restore our dignity and deter future attacks. But as the story of Shechem demonstrates, such responses often create more problems than they solve. The humanitarian consequences of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire networks of relationships and dependencies. When a city is destroyed, it's not just buildings and lives that are lost. It's also the complex web of social, economic, and cultural connections that link that community to the broader region. Widows and orphans created by the violence would have needed support and care from extended family and neighboring communities. Refugees fleeing the destruction would have strained resources in other cities. Trade routes would have been disrupted, agricultural patterns disturbed, and political relationships throughout the area affected by the sudden elimination of a major population center. These ripple effects remind us that violence is never contained to its immediate targets. Every act of aggression creates consequences that spread outward, affecting people who had no involvement in the original conflict and no say in how it was resolved. The brothers' desire to punish those who had harmed their sister ended up harming countless innocent people who happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. The role of group psychology in escalating the conflict cannot be ignored. What began as the justified anger of two brothers quickly became a coordinated family effort involving multiple participants. The transformation from individual outrage to collective violence demonstrates how group dynamics can amplify emotions and reduce individual moral reasoning. Modern research has shown how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary violence when they feel supported by their group and convinced of the righteousness of their cause. The brothers at Shechem provide an early example of how collective identity and shared purpose can override personal moral judgment, leading to actions that individuals might never consider on their own. The calculated nature of their deception makes their actions even more troubling than a crime of passion might have been. They didn't simply react in anger, they developed a careful plan that exploited their enemies' trust and religious devotion. This level of premeditation reveals a willingness to use any means necessary to achieve their goals, regardless of the moral implications. The eager participation of Shechem's men in the circumcision requirement reveals how economic incentives can override other considerations in human decision-making. They were willing to undergo a painful procedure and adopt foreign religious practices because they saw the potential benefits of alliance with Jacob's prosperous family. Their tragic miscalculation cost them their lives and destroyed their community. This dynamic of economic motivation intersecting with cultural and religious differences remains relevant in contemporary conflicts around the world. Groups often find themselves making compromises or concessions based on material considerations, only to discover that their partners had ulterior motives or hidden agendas that make cooperation impossible. The absence of women's voices throughout the narrative reflects broader patterns in ancient historical writing that privileged male perspectives, while treating women as secondary characters in their own stories. The women of Shechem who were widowed, the daughters who were orphaned, the mothers who lost their sons, all disappear from the record as completely as Dinah herself. This systematic exclusion of female experiences and perspectives has shaped our understanding of ancient cultures in ways that we're only beginning to recognize and address. The challenge for contemporary readers is to read between the lines, to imagine the experiences that weren't deemed worthy of preservation, while also acknowledging the limitations of our sources and the dangers of imposing modern assumptions on ancient realities. The silence surrounding trauma and its aftermath in the biblical narrative reflects the limited understanding of psychological healing that characterized ancient cultures. People were expected to simply move forward from traumatic experiences without the benefit of professional help, or even widespread social acknowledgement of their ongoing needs. This creates additional layers of tragedy in stories like Dinah's, as survivors would have been forced to cope with their trauma in isolation, without the support systems and therapeutic resources that we now understand to be essential for healing. The absence of any mention of care for trauma survivors in ancient texts may reflect not just editorial omission, but the very real lack of adequate frameworks for understanding and addressing psychological wounds. The impact of this story on subsequent generations of women in Jacob's family would have been profound and lasting. Every daughter born into the household would have grown up knowing what happened to Dinah, learning from her example about the precarious nature of female existence and the potentially catastrophic consequences of seeking independence or connection beyond family boundaries. This pattern of intergenerational trauma transmission has been documented extensively in modern psychological research, which shows how the effects of violence and oppression can be passed down through families and communities for generations. The lessons learned from Dinah's experience would have shaped the behavior, expectations, and life choices of women who never knew her, but who lived in the shadow of her story. The theological questions raised by this narrative continue to challenge readers seeking to understand divine justice and human responsibility. The absence of clear divine commentary on the events at Shechem forces us to wrestle with complex moral issues without easy answers or comfortable resolutions. Perhaps this is precisely the point that the biblical editors wanted to preserve. Maybe the inclusion of difficult stories like Dinah's serves to remind us that the path of faith often involves moral ambiguity, that divine election doesn't guarantee perfect behavior, and that God's purposes can work through flawed human beings without endorsing their actions. The story's treatment of cultural and religious difference remains painfully relevant for contemporary discussions about diversity, integration, and interfaith relations. What began as a potential opportunity for peaceful coexistence and mutual enrichment was transformed into an instrument of destruction through the weaponization of religious and cultural differences. This pattern of exploiting differences for violent purposes has unfortunately been repeated throughout human history, as groups that might otherwise coexist peacefully find their distinctions manipulated by those seeking to justify aggression or advance their own interests. The brothers' example serves as a warning about how easily sacred symbols and practices can be corrupted when they serve human ambition rather than divine purpose. Modern readers struggle with this narrative precisely because it challenges comfortable assumptions about heroes and villains, about clear moral categories and satisfying conclusions. The story refuses to provide easy answers, instead presenting us with a complex web of motivations, actions, and consequences that resist simple ethical categorization. Yet this moral complexity may be exactly what makes Dinah's story so important and enduring. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the ways good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, about how the desire for justice can transform into something much darker and more destructive. The story serves as a powerful reminder about the critical importance of centering survivors' voices and experiences in narratives about violence and its aftermath. Dinah's silence becomes a form of testimony about how often women's perspectives are marginalized, overlooked, or deemed irrelevant to the larger stories being told about power, honor, and justice. Her absence from the latter part of the narrative challenges us to become better listeners, to create space for the voices that have been systematically excluded from historical records, and to ensure that our responses to injustice truly serve the needs of those who have been harmed, rather than the egos or agendas of those claiming to defend them. In our contemporary context, Dinah's story speaks directly to ongoing struggles with sexual violence, family honor, cultural conflict, and the treatment of survivors. It challenges us to examine our own responses to injustice, to consider whether we truly center the needs and agency of those who have been harmed, and to question whether our desire for justice sometimes transforms into something that creates more harm than healing. The questions raised by this ancient narrative continue to resonate across cultures and centuries, forcing us to grapple with fundamental issues about power, gender, violence, and human dignity. They inspire us to imagine better ways of responding to injustice, while also acknowledging the complex realities that make such responses difficult to achieve in practice. Perhaps most importantly, Dinah's story reminds us that behind every act of violence, every political conflict, every historical event, are real people with complex emotions, ongoing lives, and stories that deserve to be told in their own words. Her disappearance from the biblical narrative becomes a call to remember the forgotten, to listen for the silenced voices, and to recognize the full humanity of those whose experiences have been deemed too dangerous, too complicated, or too uncomfortable to preserve. The untold fate of Dinah challenges us to become better storytellers ourselves, to ensure that the voices of the marginalized and vulnerable are not lost to history, and to create space for the complex truths that don't fit neatly into our preferred narratives about justice and redemption. Her silence speaks across the centuries, calling us to listen more carefully, to question more deeply, and to remember that every person's story matters, especially those whose voices have been forgotten or deliberately ignored. As we close this exploration of one of Scripture's most troubling yet profound mysteries, we're left not with answers, but with better questions. Not with comfortable conclusions, but with necessary challenges to our assumptions about justice, gender, and power. Dinah's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the most important voices are often the ones we never get to hear, and that our responsibility as readers, as believers, as human beings, is to ensure that such silencing never happens again in our own time and in our own communities. The daughter of Jacob, whose fate remains untold, continues to speak through her very silence, reminding us that behind every headline, every conflict, every act of violence are real people whose full stories deserve to be known, remembered, and honored. Her legacy challenges us to do better, to listen more carefully, and to ensure that no one else disappears from the narrative of their own life.